Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our virtual garden workshop, Freedom and Financial Security, How Gardens Unite, Enrich, and Empower Community. My name is Katrina Lashley. I'm the program coordinator here at ACM in Washington, D.C. And we're joined, of course, by our fabulous garden facilitator, Derek Thomas. Derek gives a little wave. He'll be joining us in conversation later on in the presentation. So happy Juneteenth. Thank you so much for spending a portion of your morning with us. I'm very excited to have you with us today. The first part of our workshop really is very much inspired by our Juneteenth celebration. I'll be joined in conversation by Fabiola Delgado, who's the newest member of our education team at the museum in a couple of minutes. So for the past 155 years, I know it's our newest federal holiday, but it's been celebrated in communities across the country and also internationally as well too. For the past 155 years, really is the celebration of the end of the freeing of the last enslaved members of American society, which took place in 1865. And so I want to quickly give you some historical context, and then we'll move on into connecting it to why we thought it was a really important part and should be explored as part of our gardening celebration today. And so Civil War in January of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. So it was issued in fall of 1862, but went into effect in January 1863, which basically ended slavery in the states that were in open rebellion against the Union. So it's very important to note that slavery did not end across the nation with the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation. It only ended slavery in those territories that were in open rebellion against the Union. And so January 1st, it goes into effect in those Confederate states that were under occupation by Union troops. As Union troops moved through the South, emancipation followed. It wasn't until Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, that in Galveston, Texas, the order was read for the final time, which essentially freed the last remaining enslaved in the Union itself. And so starting from that year forward, every year after, starting in Galveston and moving through Texas, spreading to the South, and then especially with the Great Migration, Juneteenth became a celebration that was a major part of community events and celebrations throughout the course of these past decades. So it was celebrated in many ways in different communities. For some, it was a church celebration. It was connected to food festivities, to literary festivals. You had the reading Proclamation, you had music, you had celebration, really a time of reflection, thinking of the past, but also planning for the future. And so as we were preparing for our current series of garden events, we realized that this workshop would take place on June 19th. We're very aware of how much it connected to the overall theme of our growing season for this year. And so for the past couple of years or so, Alethia Amos, who's a curator here at the museum, was researching and documenting the history of Barry Farm Hillsdale here in Washington, D.C., east of the Anacostia River. And so Barry Farm Hillsdale was founded in 1867, 2 years after the official end of the war. The Freedmen's Bureau purchased a big parcel of land, and land was broken into 1 acre lots. And you had formerly enslaved and formerly freed residents who purchased 1 acre lots and established this community. And as Alethia was doing her work and research, we were very struck by the importance of green space, the importance of cultivation of land, connection of land to this idea of how freedom, emancipation, liberty can be enacted. So as you're building a community in freedom, how do you achieve not only emotional, but also physical and financial stability? And for many residents of Barry Farm Hillsdale, they look to their knowledge, expertise of the land. So freedom is literally built in a physical space, but also stored in a physical space, these green spaces. And so you had very quickly the creation of these truck gardens. So a truck garden basically is a very small cultivation where it's fruits, it's vegetables and flowers, and they're grown for market, for direct sale to various consumers. And so you had, this Barry Farm Hillsdale, you have this community is thriving, surviving very much based on the support from their agricultural output. They're very much a part of the food production, the food system of the area. And you have stories, we have oral histories, memories of family members growing in their garden lots, their 1 acre lots, and taking their produce across the Anacostia River to the various markets in the area. And so we're very struck with this idea that freedom could be found in your stewardship of your connection to your green spaces. And what does freedom mean and what different forms can it take? And so thinking back to 1865 with the reading of the Proclamation in Galveston, Texas, Moving forward 2 years, taking place what's going on east of the river in DC and in many communities across the nation, how were people envisioning freedom? How were they following a path to freedom, and how they're trying to protect their freedoms? And so we understand, we ask you to think about in our gardening workshops, your connection to your green space, whether it be a garden, a backyard, your windowsill, your patio, how do you connect to this larger legacy and history of connection to place and stewardship to place? And how is a stewardship of place very much an important role of defining self, defining your culture, connection to your personhood, and how is this taking place over the span of time throughout American history? And so in 1865 in Galveston, Texas, moving forward, in 1867, taking place east of River, DC, in Barrack Farms, Hillsdale, many of these residents were stepping into this legacy that had been going on for centuries before, the official ending of slavery. Many individuals found a pathway to personhood, to freedom, to emancipation through the stewardship of their green spaces. And today we want to take a step back to kind of reflect back on the individuals who long before 1865 found freedom, found personhood, found a sense of community in kind of cultivating and navigating the various spaces of their community. And we want to kind of focus in on a local person, a local heroine, Alethia Tanner, who I would say she was born at the very end of the 18th century and she died in 1863. So her life spans, right, this movement from these individual pathways to freedom to the large debate and tensions and the physical fight for freedom in this country. And how she and many members of her family found freedom from pathways of freedom, emancipation, and personhood through the cultivation, stewardship, and I would say expertise in their green spaces, in their garden plots. And so in conversation with Fabiola Delgado, we explore her story as an example of pathways to freedom and how that was continued with the residents of Barrack Farm, Hillsdale, and how it continues today east of the river with continued cultivation, and I would say care and stewardship of green spaces east of the Anacostia River, and how that really ties into this overall theme of freedom and a kind of acknowledgement of Juneteenth and the celebration. And I would say ongoing struggles and movements for justice and equity that still are ongoing to this very day. So Fabiola, I'll turn the stage over to you and you can join us, let us in conversation.
Thank you so much, Katrina. A pleasure to be here. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to jump right in. I want to ask people in the audience that if you have comments or questions, you can drop them in the chat. My name is Fabiola Delgado. You can call me Fa. As Katrina mentioned, I'm a new member at the Anacostia Community Museum as an experience developer. And that title, it's hard to see it, is a little bit of an education, a little bit of curatorial, a little bit of, how do we make something that's accessible for everybody? And really, as an educator, I feel like education is not about teaching, but about learning together. So I'm going to start with this plot of a green space. It's in Washington, D.C. If anybody knows what this space is, you can type it in the chat. Let's see. And you have the address there, so you can kind of get an idea of where it is. This park right here is Tanner Park, Alethia Tanner Park, which is in Noma or New York Avenue, the neighborhood. And when we first saw it, it was very interesting because the park had been developed. It's a huge park. It's about 2 acres or more, actually. And the community actually gave input on what they wanted in the park, what they wanted in this space, and how they wanted to call it. Over 100 names were submitted, and one in particular got over 60% of the vote by an online election. And that name was Alethia Tanner. Why do I want to go now? There we go. Alethia Browning Tanner. Her story is so incredible, and it's fascinating to me how very little we know about her from history books, other than trying to find pieces of her name and her story in the stories of other people. While she was in the periphery, she very much was her own person and is part of a legacy of Washington, D.C. So I want to take you all to 1785, just for a little context, that year, John Adams had traveled as the first ambassador to the United States, or of the United States, to Great Britain to meet King George, as an ambassador of the new republic. That same year, the dollar was adopted as the official currency of the United States. So that's just to take us a little bit back in time, and we're in 1785 when Alethia was born in this plantation. She was born into slavery. She was born in captivity by the Bell Pratt family in the Chelsea plantation in Upper Marlboro in PG County. That house, you can see it from the before and then the after. The house today still exists, and it was abandoned for many years. And after restoration and a lot of fixing, it now serves as the Boys and Girls Club of the Kittery, Largo, Mitchellville area. Now, when Alethia was born, she had two sisters, one of them Sophia. She was able to negotiate with their enslaver, Rachel Pratt, the use of a small garden in the area for her to cultivate vegetables, for her to grow vegetables and fruits and be able to sell them in market, kind of like the truck gardens, to then, with that money, which of course there needed to be lots of steps to get that permission, she was able to purchase her husband's freedom, George Bell. He eventually started working in DC. He moved to Washington, DC, and through his work, he was able then to help out the rest of his family. Alethia, seeing this, had the idea of how can she use the same strategy to emancipate herself, to liberate herself. And using that same resources, using the plot of garden, she started growing vegetables. And of all the places that she was able to sell them, she chose President's Park, which is today Lafayette Square. President's Park was a huge area in front of the White House. We know it's still today as Lafayette Square. And it was part of the envisioning of Washington, D.C., of having markets that served as a gathering space for people of all backgrounds, whether willingly or not. And at the same time, it was kind of like competing with the markets in Alexandria, where people had to go somehow and get their food, animals, music instruments, clothing, all sorts of things that we would find at a public market. At Lafayette Square, in front of the White House, there is a very important character which gives us a lot of information about Alethia Tanner, and it's then President Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was known as a foodie, or he would have been known today as a foodie. And we can see that he made his own purchases. He would go to the park to, buy vegetables, to buy lots of things for, hosting parties and hosting dinners at the White House. And one of the people that he would buy food from was Alethia Tanner. Tanner at the park was able to make many connections, including Thomas Jefferson. And of the sale of her vegetables, she was able to raise $1,400, this is in 1810, to buy her own freedom. $1,400 is a lot of money today. Back then, it would be an equivalent of $30,000. And even though it sounds like a lot of money, especially to save, to buy something, the thing that she was buying was her freedom, her liberation, her personhood. And so it's both a great amount of money and such little. What do you think a life is worth? I don't think it's worth $30,000 for sure. So it's just one of the many feats that Alethia was able to achieve. And not only that, but through the sale of her garden and vegetable that she was growing, she liberated herself and about 20 other family members. We can see over here, there's on one side, there's an invoice for medical services provided to workers by Thomas Jefferson White House. And we can see there's a line over here where Alethia is typed, is written down, which gives us evidence that Alethia, aka Alethia, might have actually worked for Thomas Jefferson at some point. On the other side, we see a vegetable market report that Thomas Jefferson did. It's kind of funny to think of a president of a nation, of a nation's nation, as Thomas Jefferson, to spend his free time, whatever that was, going to market, purchasing things, scoping, the land, and actually keeping a report of what was being sold, what was in season. And I think it's fascinating because of one particular thing is how can we compare the vegetables that he was able to access then to the vegetables that we see in market today. And also it's kind of like a story of what was being eaten, what was the demand, is it similar to today, is it different? I was surprised to see grapes was one of the fruits that were being sold at the market in Washington, D.C. Because in my head today, I don't see vineyards nearby unless you go, farther down in Virginia. But a lot of it is very similar, like parsley and tomatoes, potatoes, carrots, endives. It's just really fascinating to see through bits of history and what's being recorded to try to find the background and like who are the players on the periphery really making a huge change, like Alethia Tanner. There's something really fascinating too about how she was able to buy or to navigate an entire system, not only fixed on her demise, but also who were the people that she had to interact to be able to make it to the market. Starting with her enslaver, Rachel Pratt, who she had to negotiate to be allowed to have a permit to sell vegetables at market, to use the land in the plantation where she was at, and then mobilizing it to the market. This is way before refrigerated trucks and trains. And so a lot of the gardeners in the markets, most of them were women, they had to trundle all of their produce, all of their products to the different markets in the city. I don't know if you're familiar, but when L'Enfant was designing the city, there were 3 major markets in DC that were in the plans of the city. One of them still exists today, which is Eastern Market. There was Center Market and Western Market. Some of them didn't get done until way later. But then the one in front of the White House, how long would it take, Alethia to trundle in carriage, and then she has to befriend, carriage drivers, build a trust that she's not going to get, her produce stolen. Also, the enslaver has to be part of that, structure to allow her to go from point A to point B very early in the morning to get to the park and then sell. This is a person who couldn't read or write and still was able to manage a small business that grew actually into a very large business. Then with that money, as I mentioned before, she was able to raise $1,400 to purchase her own freedom. And what's interesting after going through some records is that she didn't pay Rachel Pratt, her enslaver, directly, but she actually used another person, Joseph Doherty, who, as we can see over here, he purchased her. And what we can, then see is that he was an ally. He was a free, he was a white man who purchased Alethia Tanner from her enslaver. And about 10 days later, he gave her manumission. He conceded or provided for the documents for her freedom. And so throughout the time where Alethia was working and meeting people, networking, really planning for something a lot bigger than her life in a plot of land in PG County, she meets this man and is able to negotiate again with him to pay him so he can purchase her. She's using the system that's against her in her favor. If I cannot just escape, because I was there's a lot of danger, obviously, even when you were a freed Black person, she was able to find all the game rules and use them on her benefit. As we can see here, he purchased, and she was paying Joseph in parts. And then the last payment, about $200, was made to Rachel. 10 days later, she had been freed. And then we see all of the legacy that Alethia has, that's still surviving in DC today. Even before her freedom, Alethia was a huge moral supporter and financial supporter of the creation of different schools and churches in the community. One of them, as we see here, is the Lincoln School, that we assume is the former Bell School. If you remember from early on, George Bell, Sophia's husband, Sophia's was Alethia's sister, was able to gain freedom and start, building connections to make, advancements for the community. He, along with Moses Liverpool and Nicholas Franklin, founded one of the first schools for free Blacks in Washington, D.C., the Bell School. And although there's very few records of it, we did find this picture in the 1860s of the Lincoln School, but it's in the same location that the Bell School used to be. So we can only assume that that was the building where it used to be, and how incredible it is that this woman was able to achieve so much, even with the limitations that she was born into. Another really fantastic find was this. Beyond the moral support and financial support, she was a huge community leader, and she helped found the Israel Bethel Church, also the Union Bethel with her nephew, and different churches around the city. Back when then these two churches merged, the creation of the Metropolitan AME Church was founded, and Tanner was not only the only woman who was a contributor to the foundation of this church, but it was the second highest contribution. As you possibly know, the Metropolitan AME Church is the longest running church in Washington, D.C. And again, it just goes to show how incredible journey this woman has, and how she knew what was important to her and to her community. She knew that institutions had to be created for their advancement, for their education, and to be able to go from point A to point B to point C, to have a legacy that still lives today in the city is outstanding. There's something very, let's say, funny. To find women in the history books is just so difficult. And it's incredibly difficult. And then to find Black women is even more difficult. So I have to thank Tamika Nunley for the professor Tamika Nunley for all the research, and so many other people who've really been digging into history books, into records, going to the archives. And even though they cannot find some, a piece of paper about this one person, through studying, all the other people, studying Thomas Jefferson, we're able to find all those hidden histories that really need to come forth. And one of the questions that Tamika Nunley asks in her book, At the Threshold of Liberty, is, what does it mean to define and preserve a sense of self in a society that supposes a narrow definition of what it meant to be a Black woman? With these, I think this question, she asked in the context of slavery, in the context of 18th and early 19th century DC, but it's a question that we still see today, that we can still ask today. And how do we find Black womanhood? How do we find personhood? And how incredible it is that humanity, no matter what, is inherent of all people, whether legally it's not a term that was utilized for Black people back then. And so there's also something so poetic about the use of the land. There's a quote that, I can't remember who said how the land, it's not the criminal. It saw the crime, but it's not the criminal. And there's a really beautiful and tragic poetic, experience of using the soil and really reconnecting, reconciling our human nature with the nature, to then achieve a sense of liberation, achieve a sense of freedomhood and personhood for her and so many family members. I would like to invite Derek, who I know you're at the gardens. Thank you, Derek, for joining us, because all of the questions and all of the story of Alethia using the gardens, using vegetables, using the land to emancipate herself is just so inspiring. So I want to invite you to also join in conversation. And for those of you who are watching on Zoom, to send us your questions, write them in the chat or comments. You're more than welcome to do so.
Thank you so much for that history lesson. I think as this whole season has unpacked, I keep learning more and more about, I know why I garden because I love it, but I keep learning just how important it is to also teach someone to garden. I think there's so many questions from what you have just educated us on. My first thing is, how does someone get from PG County all the way to Lafayette Park? Because we're talking Upper Marlboro. It's a 30 or 40 minute drive without traffic in this day and age. How does someone get there? With a horse and buggy, I guess, or how, there must have been a lot of people behind the scenes.
Absolutely. And you're right. If today, let's think about it in the terms of, comparing. Today, it takes about a 40-minute drive in a car with air conditioning, despite, no matter the climate. So, right now in the summer, you can come here. Back then, you can only imagine how long would it take. I think we can go to Google Maps and try to figure out how long would it take to walk it. Yes, with the current conditions and the current paved roads, as you mentioned, it would take a buggy, it would take a carriage, and a lot of people, as you mentioned, behind the scenes. She cannot just come by herself expecting that her enslaver would, just let her go. There's a lot of negotiation, and that takes a lot of savvy, a lot of expertise, building trust with all sorts of people, from Rachel Pratt to maybe the neighboring farm, to the drivers, carriage drivers, people who along the road, you would fear like maybe there's robbers, or maybe you have to pay a fee to be led into Washington DC. Like, what are all of those places to bajarse de la mula, as we say in Spanish? You have to get off your mule. You have to
right.
something.
That also brings me to another. As you're speaking, I'm thinking about something else. So the tariffs. We're thinking about the amount of money that Alethia needed to raise to free herself, and we're thinking about $1,400, which is not a little bit of change even in this day and age. So it had to be. You talk about the dollar just being brought into currency. So, before that dollar being brought into currency, people were trading in cents and 10 pence, I guess is what it's called, But what were all of the moving pieces that had to come together? Because if, say, getting to $1,400 is the goal, but what were all of the obstacles that would have been confronted? I mean, I'm sure that there had to be a fee for the market. I'm sure that there had to be all of these other things that had to be paid. It's just very, very, you think about it and you're like, wow.
Absolutely. And when you bring the question of the market, also to put it in context, which is very painful, you know, she has to go to market, she has to pay for a fee to have, you know, a stall. In this market in front of the White House, you know, slavery is still a thing. She is a slave, she's an enslaved person. And so in the market, you not only buy food, you buy everything that you need, you buy products, and then you could then buy also enslaved people. In one corner of the market, there would be a slave market. In another part, there would be clothing. In another part, there would be beauty products. In another area, there would be the food and the vegetables, animals. So just being in that scenario, I cannot even imagine how painful that could be. And you still have to go through all of those steps. We found, you know, through, you know, records here and there, like, let's try to find the archives. How much did things cost back then? And we can't find, I couldn't find the unit price, but there's like a pack or a, you know, a pound of carrots costed in 1807, more or less, about 25 cents. Same with potatoes, and then endives. Let's try to find what were the price. So between 15 and 30 cents is what a pack of vegetables, depending on what it was, costed. So if we do the math, you know, how many packs of potatoes, how many packs of carrots do you need to sell to get $1,400? Like, still today, like, how many do you need to sell to get $1,400?
Exactly. I mean, and even thinking about it from a gardener's point of view, you know, we have discussed and our follow our, we've always discussed just at the whim of Mother Nature. So what about the year and the carrots and the potatoes just don't produce? So you're getting 15 cents for a pack of potatoes, but what happens if your yield is down by 50 or 80%? So, you know, all of those things were challenges that just come to mind. It was such a feat for Alethia to raise that kind of money, and then her philanthrop, you know, her giving continued to happen, because you talk about the church and everything else. It's an amazing story.
Exactly. And you're mentioning
to break in quick, I think we have a question from Yvonne. Is your hand raised, Yvonne? Do you have a question you want to ask or comment? I see your hands raised. Hello?
Hi, is Yvonne here?
Your hand's raised. So could you unmute her?
But, you know, while we wait for Yvonne, thank you so much, Derek, for all your comments. You are at the mercy of not only Mother Nature, and there's, you know, digging in. It would take about 3 years for a skilled worker to come up with that sum of money, to come up with $1,400. And like, how long would it take Alethia to get that sum of money? Even though she paid in parts, it's really a feat. And all the while, she didn't just raise $1,400, as you mentioned. She was a philanthropist. So she was raising money for herself, for family members, for schools, for churches, for spaces of gathering and community and advancement of their community. So yeah, she's quite the feat. I'm like, anytime I'm gonna feel like I can't do this, or I don't know if I can do this, it's really hard, I'm like, no, like, what would Alethia Tanner do? That's my new mantra.
Excellent. And, you know, we are getting into the gardening part of it now. And I think one of the things that I thought about as you were giving your list of vegetables and fruit and everything that would have been grown and marketed is how many of the same things we grow today, and how many of those same things have fallen off of the menu of certain areas that we now call food deserts. Like the participants that were here at the last workshop, or if you weren't, I'll give you a brief history of what we did. We took potatoes. We took regular potatoes from the store that would have been in your home that started to grow. We removed the eyes that were growing. We cut the potatoes and we let them sit in the sun for about an hour as we did our workshop. And then we planted those pieces of potatoes, and I want you to see what they now are.
Thank you.
This is our official potato patch this year. And potatoes are, you can see everywhere that we put a potato in, we now have a plant that's growing. Under the ground is where the money part is. That's where we're going to be getting soon enough. Once all of this vegetation starts to wilt and starts to die back, the plant is going to tell us that the potatoes are ready. And so I would expect, if things continue going the way that they are during the August workshop, we're going to be able to harvest our potatoes. So from one potato that you would have probably thrown out because it had started to grow, we now have a little potato patch. We also put in squash during our last planting. Now we did 2 hills of squash, and remember I talked to everyone about squash needing more than one plant because it has to cross-pollinate. One of our hills of squash was not successful, but...
Hi, Derek, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've lost your visual.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. Are we back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sorry about that. So we did put in 2 hills of squash. We didn't need the 2 hills of squash, but sometimes squash fails, and I know that. So one hill where we have this clear spot where we're going to put something else in here today, that entire set of 3 plants failed. Here, however, and you can see our hill, we did a mound. The hill is still in place, and what that does is it keeps the squash high enough up. It also protects the squash. There's a squash beetle that'll get in there and actually bore a hole into the squash. It protects it from that. And as you see down here, we've had our first little baby zucchini squash is happening right off of that bloom. And when you see this, if you can bring the camera that way, where you can see that baby squash, that means it has cross-pollinated, and that means we are going to be successful at getting squash out of this pile, or should I say clump of squash. The other thing that's growing a little bit slow this year, and if anybody has melons in their gardens, they've probably experienced this. The melons this year are being a little bit putsy, but they're starting to take off. This is a cantaloupe that we put in. And the reason they are taking their time this year is because we've had very, very cool days, and then we've had very, very extreme hot days. And melons like it to be warm. They don't like it to be cool. And the cool that we've had in between may be what made our squash go, the second hill, and maybe what is affecting our melon. The last thing that I want to show you here, and it's a housekeeping bit, this squash is starting to show a little bit of signs of powdery mildew. If you see that in your garden and you want to keep things organic, we want to completely remove the leaves that we see with the powdery mildew. It's a mildew, and it's called powdery mildew because it's got that powdery white look. You want to remove it. You don't want to put it in your compost or the spores will spread. You see it started to spread here. And if you look up here, it's also started to spread to this leaf. So I'll go back and clean up and make the cuts all the way in a little bit later. But anytime that you see this in your garden, if you want to continue to be 100% organic, take it out of the garden. I'm going to bag this up in a plastic bag, and I'm going to dispose of this in a place where it's not going to have the opportunity to spread back to the garden. Now, Margaret, can I see the pruners that I've got over there? Oh, my assistant Margaret is here today doing a wonderful job. Margaret, they're right there hanging on the. This was our lettuce patch, and we are in the middle of June. And one of the things that we did was we put in, Margaret, and these, dispose of those where it's not going to spread into the garden. We put in broccoli, and we put in romaine lettuce. Now, if your romaine lettuce looks like this right now, don't fret, because what you really want from a lettuce plant is the leaf. And although this is not a perfect romaine leaf, it is a romaine leaf. So what you want to do, if your lettuce does this, and the reason that the lettuce did this year is, once again, we had cool, but then we had these spikes of heat. And when temperatures get up in the 90s, it tells plants like lettuce, broccoli, all of your cool season plants, it tells them that it's time to bloom. It's time to make seeds. It's time to get ready for that next generation. And that's basically what we don't eat. So what you can do, though, as long as the lettuce has not gone to seed, I don't see the seeds in there. What you can do is take your lettuce. We'll call this, we'll give this a different name. We'll call this tall romaine. We can cut the lettuce. We can clean up the leaves. We don't want the stalk. But if you see, what I'm putting together here is becoming like a traditional head of romaine lettuce that you would see in the grocery store. The only problem with the romaine this year, and this is completely edible, it's going to be some of the best greens that you've ever eaten if you haven't had a fresh vegetable garden. And what you see here, the stalk is the result of the heat. This stalk is going to be recycled. It's going to be turned into compost. And the lettuce, I'm going to have for a really nice Caesar salad this afternoon. This part, I'm going to go ahead and clean this off. This part, I'm going to toss over there because I've got to talk about compost a little later. Now, our broccoli hated this weather. This is what our broccoli has become. This is nothing but flowers, nothing but seeds. There's seeds there. If you want, you can leave this on the plant until it dries. You can harvest the broccoli seed and you can replant broccoli seed in the late fall. Broccoli will live through the winter and it will come back next year and you will have a head of broccoli. But this, I don't need. I'm going to go ahead. The seeds are immature. So if I throw it in the compost pile now, there's not a chance that they're going to grow. I'm going to throw that in the compost. Now, there was one broccoli plant. Maybe it just wanted to communicate, and not communicate, but cooperate with me. Maybe it was in the shade of the other plants. I'm not sure why it didn't bolt, but we've got a beautiful, beautiful broccoli plant. And that is broccoli. Now, the other argument, if you see the size of this head of broccoli, when you get to the grocery and you see a head of broccoli that's that big, that's the difference in organic gardening. Many times your organic vegetables are going to be smaller, but this is going to be a wonderful addition. I maybe won't be doing a traditional Caesar salad today because maybe I'll put a little bit of egg and maybe I'll add just a little bit of broccoli. Now, the leaves. These leaves, as you can tell, they've got some holes. If you don't mind the holes, you can still wash these. You can chop these up. You can also put these, not the vein, not this middle part, but you can take all the leaf part off, just the leafy part. You can chop this up and you can put this in if you like to do green smoothies and things like that. You can definitely eat this as a green smoothie. It's going to be a little bit tough to eat it as a salad because it's gotten a bit beyond. Now, if you want to sweeten up your regular greens, we've got some kale that we're going to be talking about next. If you want to sweeten that up a little bit, you can definitely do that by adding a little bit of the greens from your broccoli plants. This has got a sweeter taste than the kale, and it's going to be a way to get away from adding any type of meat to your kale to give it a seasoning, because some people would like to add a bit of a ham hock or something like that to your kale. If that's your thing, absolutely do that. But if you want to sweeten up the taste of the kale a little bit and you have broccoli greens around, go ahead and add the fresh broccoli greens. Now, we get over to the kale. And this kale, everyone that was here 2 months ago, we planted this actually as seeds. The wonderful thing about our kale garden is that it overproduced. Before the show started today, what I went in here and did was, and the plants are still here, I went in here and I harvested all of the kale. I left the little nubs. And what I mean by that is I went in and I cut all of that away, right? And so I left this in place. This is going to grow back out. And depending on how our summer is, it's either going to produce leaves or it's going to want to bolt and it's going to want to flower. But before it bolts, it's going to produce enough leaves. This little patch here is going to produce enough leaves that I'll be able to get some baby kale off of these mature plants. I'll get baby kale leaves off of these mature plants in the middle of summer. The rest of this, I'm going to clean and I'm going to, and this is good enough to clean and to cook. Now, I've got a pile of kale here that is going to be the pile of kale that we clean. And if you've gone into the grocery store, usually it's around holiday time. They have the big bunches of kale around Thanksgiving. Our kale, once again, the leaves are not as big, but definitely we can take the leaf part off. We can go ahead and cook this. That's going to be cooked. This stemmy part is going to go down here for the compost pile. And so we've got a pile of kale that we need to work with. What are we going to do with the remaining kale? I'm going to leave the kale that's in the middle here because I'll be able to use these leaves as I need them, either chopped up really fine in a fresh salad, or I can take everything, pull it off of the stem because the stem tends to be a little bit stringy, and I can pop this in the blender and have a smoothie. So I'm going to leave the center piece of kale. All the rest of this, Margaret, if we can go ahead and remove all of this, but I want us to go ahead and pull this out by the roots because then we're going to put the tomatoes in the back when I come back through. And the way we did it earlier, just pulling, yeah, this part we're going to leave and that part we're going to leave. But all of this, the rest of this, we're going to pull the entire root out. You want to show the folks what we did? Just want to pull it all out by the root. And I got you without your gloves, Margaret. I'm sorry. There we go. And we're going to do that all the way down, but we're going to leave that center aisle. And then when we come back through here, we've got, today we're going to add in, depending on time, this is a pickling cucumber. And what that means is, I'm not going to do pickles because it's a little bit of work. But what it gives me is it gives me a really short cucumber that I love because I can use them in salads and they're nice and they're fat and they're just, you know, they're probably about maybe 5 or 6 inches long, but they have a really intense taste. So I'm going to add some cucumbers to this bed today. And I'm also going to add a larger tomato plant. Now, the tomato plants that I have, one of the things that we're going to do when we get to that point, we're going to discuss planting it a little bit deeper. We're going to cut a lot of this off of there. And we're going to put that tomato plant in nice and deep today. Why are we going to do that? Because that's going to give us enough root growth, or extra root growth is what I should say. Do I have a spot that's open there, Margaret? Yes. All right, let's go ahead and pop this tomato. And then I just need the shovel. I think you have the shovel in here. So what we're going to do with this is, and this is a tomato called Heat Master. This garden gets, and your garden should also get at least 6 hours of full sun. This garden gets probably 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours of full sun. It's in full sun. We're facing south, and so therefore it's nothing but sun in this garden, which is great. The plants love it. But I got a variety that's called Heat Master. This is a hybrid that's actually made for the heat. And let's do the bigger shovel. So when we pop this out, if there's any, this root ball looks really, really good, actually. There's a slug there that we're going to remove and get rid of. The slugs can wreak havoc. And so what we're going to do is we're going to open up a hole. And Margaret, can you get the, I've got a bag of compost sitting over there. If you can get me some, just enough that's in this, you can break open the container. Here you go, Mark. Break open the bag and just get me some in there. Thank you. All right, now we're gonna pop this down in there. Down into the hole. And Margaret's getting the compost. I'm gonna leave this as a little bit of a depression. The compost also, if you've been out and about trying to get compost this year, there's a shortage on it. And the reason there's a shortage on it is everybody's gardening. So what they've got as a secondary compost this year is a leaf product. It's a dehydrated leaf product. But you see this is my black gold. I'm gonna add that all the way around under the soil. And then I'm gonna, and any clumps that you have, break it on up. Break up your clumps. And then I'm gonna pile this a little bit high. I've got enough room in this planter. I'll pile it a little bit high because what I want, remember how we cut all of those leaves up to here? So now all that stem that's in there, and you would not do this with every plant. Tomatoes are one of the few plants that you can do this. The tomato along the stem will make additional roots. More roots means more water, more nutrients, and a bigger tomato plant. This plant we'll put in a cage. We're gonna have our kale, and we're gonna have, we've even got some juvenile string beans that I forgot to show you. Because the other thing about raised gardens and planting in a area that you have a definite amount of space, you don't have an indefinite amount of space. So, but our green beans is producing. So we've even got green beans in this garden, which is going to be amazing. So we're going to have tomatoes here. We're going to have some kale for those smoothies. We're going to harvest some of our kale today, but we're also adding in tomatoes. This tomato is an indeterminate tomato. And what that means is it just continues to grow and grow and grow. There are determinate tomatoes, and I want to talk about those, and we're going to go up to the other garden bed. This is a hybrid of a Roma tomato, and this is a determinate tomato. What that means, it's only going to get to be a determined size that the plant, through its crossbreeding and hybridization, has a stop point. That other tomato that we were planting does not have a stop point. It'll continue to grow, continue to grow, continue to grow. This is going to stop growing at a certain point. The great thing about these Romas is that if you know Roma, this is actually a hybrid. This is one that's a lot more heat tolerant, and it's a space saver. Because what I'm going to do in a future workshop, in our August workshop, we're going to start planting things for the fall. This will be an excellent spot for us to put in some more kale. We can do cilantro. We can do a lot of our cool season herbs. We can get that another set of lettuces going, all in this space, because these tomatoes are not going to grow as big as the tomatoes that we just planted. And behind them, we have a plant that I plant every year. We planted this as seeds, and this is our sunflower patch. And we're going to talk about all the uses of sunflowers in a future workshop. Now, we're going to head over to the herb garden, but before we do that, I want to talk about pollinator plants. What was that? I just got a cue from. You got a question. Oh, we have a question, Katrina?
Yes, Dr. Burton. So what do you do to keep rodents away from your garden?
This is our rodent proofer. This is our deer proof. Hello. we put these enclosures, and the way that this works so that we can get in and out is, if you pan back over to me, we've got this set up here. We use it as a door. We bring this over, and you can find, this is an industrial grade, deer proof. And as long as you've got it going all the way down to the ground, you're not going to get the rodents or the rabbits or the animals in. What you do want to do is, if you are still getting animals in there, you want to put pins at the bottom where my foot is. You can pin the wire down to the ground, and that'll help. And then we've also got a fabric that wraps this entire garden. This is an industrial grade landscape fabric, so that even the burrowing animals like a groundhog cannot get through that. It's a 32 mil industrial grade landscape fabric. So he'll be chewing quite some time before he'd have to really want to get into this garden. And there's a lot of stuff in the woods around here for the groundhogs to eat. Because trust me, we've got groundhogs here, we've got deer, we've got a little bit of everything. And they don't get in because of the enclosures. And if you don't want to do something so big, you can do something that is just tailored to the one box that you have. So let me get this back up on here. Now, before we go to the herb, are there any more questions, Katrina?
I see your hand raised. Iman, do you have a question? Is your hand raised for a question or comment? No doubt, we can go ahead.
Okay. So we talked about the squash, and we talked about the squash being cross-pollinated by itself. But our plants don't get up and walk around. So the way that plants reproduce, it's called asexual reproduction. And what that means is they rely upon something else to get the pollen from the stamen to the pistil, which are the two parts of the plant that ultimately produce the seed. And a lot of times the seed is what we want: the tomato, the apple, the peach. All of those are vessels that Mother Nature in the plant world has designed so that it's attractive. So other animals eat the peach, they throw away the pit, and then another peach tree grows somewhere down the road. And that's how plants not only divide, but they spread. Pollinators have become big news because, of course, bees are on the decline. All of these plants that you see here are plants that get along really, really well in your garden. And some of them have been used in medicinal purposes. Some of them has been used as food sources. And some of them may have even shown up in Alethia's garden as a food source in the winter. This plant is Echinacea, and everybody has heard about the cough drops that use Echinacea. The parts of Echinacea that are good for the sore throat and different things like that, it's the leaf and it's the roots. So the roots of Echinacea, actually, I can get in there and find one. They have these little, there's one. So they have these little areas which are, they dry up, but that dried up pieces of an Echinacea root, and there'll be more. Do that, we could just clean this completely off. It would have grown out and caused another Echinacea, but there, that's the part that we want for the. You can also leaves. You can dry them. You can make them into a tea. The bees love them. The native goldfinches eat the seeds and spread the seeds. So it's a really, really great pollinator plant, and it's also a food source, like I said, for birds.
Hey, Derek, I'm sorry to interrupt. Derek, can you hear me?
This plant
My apologies. We seem to have lost Derek. We're working on getting him back. It's 1 second. Okay, Derek's signing back in. Once again, apologies, technical difficulties. It's 1 second. Hi, Derek, we see you.
Sorry about that.
Apologies,
Technology.
everyone.
All right. So, how much did we hear, Katrina? Did we hear about the Black-Eyed Susans?
The audio is pretty bad. So if you can go back a little bit, as you're talking about the pollinators, you started to kind of freeze and the audio froze. So before the Black-Eyed Susans.
Okay. So, what we were talking about was pollinators, and we talked about Echinacea. Echinacea is a really, really great. It's been used for a long time as medicinal plants, and you can see there is some sort of an insect that's actually getting some pollen out of there. So this is one of the good pollinators. Bees love this. Black-eyed Susans, they've been used for quite some time as a plant that you can see it. It's a native. It grows along the roadside. A lot of times you'll see a yellow flower this time of year blooming along the roadside. It's probably Black-eyed Susan. A non-native that we all love is lavender, and the bees love the lavender. Lavender is one of the first, like, you've seen lavender honey, and what they mean about that is that the bees that actually got a lot of the percentage of the honey that they made came from lavender blossom. And sometimes beekeepers will move certain flowers into the area of the honey. They'll grow clover fields, they'll grow lavender fields, they'll They'll grow echinacea fields, things like that, that are going to be pollinators for the plant. These are also plants that you can do on the periphery of your garden. If you want to do lavender in your herb garden, absolutely. If you wanted to add a little bit of a pop, I'm not going to physically plant this, but you could add, you know, a little bit of a decoration to the garden. We're going to have sunflowers there, but you could add a little bit of a pop of color so that it's not just tomatoes, it's not just peppers. Another plant that has been used for a long time in both gardens, and it was a food source to Native Americans. This is a hybrid, but I'm going to show you, hopefully, see one of these. And this is a daylily. And when I say this was used as a food source, what they actually harvested were on the roots, there's little growths that will occur. So at the bottom of this root here, it's still a little bit young, but at the bottom of the root, it'll grow little tiny potatoes. And those potatoes were dug up, they were blanched, and they were cooked like you would cook a potato. And so you had a decorative plant that the Native Americans would also use, the daylily, as a food source. Marigolds. Marigolds were traditionally used as a natural insecticide. What does that mean? Someone asked about pests in the garden. The marigold has a very pungent smell, very, very pungent. So what you can do with your marigolds is you can plant them as a buffer plant. And what do I mean by that? You can put them into the garden, in between the tomatoes. The animals that would want to eat the tomatoes, what they're going to really smell is the scent of this marigold. And they're going to think that everything in there is marigolds, and they're going to keep moving. So it's a really good plant to put as a buffer. And if you wanted to put one here and one here, the marigold is going to spread around 2.5, 3 feet wide. So that's going to be a big enough buffer to add into this garden. We're going to have sunflowers, we're going to have marigolds, but we're also going to have tomatoes. So our garden is not only going to be food, but the garden is going to be naturally repellent. And then the last thing I want to discuss before we move to our herb garden is a lot of people are working with very challenged spaces. So your space might just be a little patio. It may just be a slab of concrete in front of your home. You can still garden. Those Roma tomatoes I've been growing out in the garden, but I've also got one that is growing in a pot. So this planter, which would fit on anybody's front stoop, you see, is producing tomatoes for us. So the one thing about doing any of your vegetables in a pot, you want to make sure you're getting at least 6 hours of sun a day, and you want to make sure that the plant does not dry out. So you want to make sure that the soil stays nice and moist. If you're going to go away for a week to the beach, get someone on plant detail, because if not, you'll come back and all of your hard work would have been for naught. But if you have a challenging space, you can still have vegetables in containers. Do we have any questions, Katrina?
Let's see, I think there was oh yes, Ms. Young had a question from before. Ms. Young, do you still want to ask her question? Okay, we have a question from Monique. Did you say Echinacea leaf is edible?
Yes, Echinacea coneflower. It doesn't have a very good taste, but it's absolutely safe to eat. What I would do with an Echinacea leaf is I would take a leaf like this. I would actually cut it up, sit it on a paper towel and let it dry. And then I would put it into a tea. So for instance, it's a really good, it's in cough drops. So it's a really good throat soother. So if you cut it up, let it dry for about 2 days, steep a tea, whatever your favorite tea is, a mint tea or whatever, put some of this echinacea in it, and then you would actually be getting the benefits of a nice soothing tea if you have like a sore throat. But you can eat the leaves. It does have a bit of it's a bit of a strong taste. It's a bit of an acquired taste, but it is edible. Not only is it edible, but the roots are really the part that you would use if you wanted to use it for some of the medicinal purposes.
Okay, and so Ms. Young also had a question. I want to make sure that I'm getting her question correct. What is organic and what is not?
Okay, so organic gardening basically goes under the assumption that we are not adding any chemicals, any man-made substances to the earth, to the plants. So there are some people that in organic gardening will treat insects with a mineral oil. Mineral oil is a natural oil. It's not a man-made oil. It smothers the insects. But then there are purists that say, no, you don't even use that. So your definition of organic may be a little bit different than someone else's. But most importantly, what you're using is you're using a natural fertilizer. There's a company that produces all natural fertilizers, and it's a lot easier to find now that people have started doing organic gardening. You also want to make sure that your water source is a pure water source. What does that mean? You want to make sure that you don't have fluorides and different things added into the water. So what you want to try to do when you're watering the plants is to, this is why rain barrels have become very popular, because you can get the rainwater and water your plants. If you can't, then you still have organic gardening for the most part, but you're just using the city source for water. So there is some chemicals in the city source of water, but some people do have wells. If you have a well or access to a well, if you have a way to let the water sit, you can let the water sit in a big barrel. Of course, you would want to do some sort of a screen or something on it so you're not attracting mosquitoes. But you know, when you Google organic gardening, you will dive into pages and pages and pages of what it is. And it's just up to each person. But the biggest thing is not having chemicals, not having man-made chemicals in your garden.
And Erica has a question as well too. How many of your plants, which plants do you generally plant from seeds versus starters? And which plants will naturally come back next year that don't need to be replanted?
Okay, so when we get over to the herbs, I'll talk about the herbs that will come back next year and won't. Most of your vegetable plants in this area, your squash, your tomatoes, your peppers, your lettuce, most of them are either going to reach the end of their lifespan within a year. So lettuces will start to go to seed, kale will start to go to seed, broccoli will start to go to seed. Other plants will die out at the end of the year, like tomatoes and peppers, and all of those are heat-loving vegetables. And at the end of the season, in the fall, they will die out. So they will have to be replanted. There are perennial herbs. There are perennial vegetables. Some people think of rhubarb, for instance. If you've ever had rhubarb pie, they think of that as some people think of it as a fruit. Some people think of it as a vegetable. Horseradish is a perennial vegetable, but mostly the herbs are what's going to be the perennial vegetables. Now, when we're talking about herbs, there are herbs that will live 2 years. And if you look at the parsley is starting to bolt. And what does that mean? It's creating this big, tall spot that's going to be a flower pod. Okay. Also, our arugula. We planted the arugula from seed, but it's going to flower. I've left some so we can get seed. The arugula is one of them that will naturally reseed itself. It will naturally reseed and come back. The parsley is something that you can do by seed, but the plants are usually very inexpensive. With any of your vegetables, any of your herbs, any of the vegetables that you want to do, you can do them all by seed. It just depends on how much sweat equity you want. For instance, if you want tomatoes that are going to be bearing tomatoes in July and August, you need to plant those seeds inside under lights in February. The same thing with pepper plants. The same thing with some of your longer season vegetables. Things like the potatoes that we planted, things like the squash that we planted. You could plant squash seed outside after the frost-free date in your area, and you will get squash this year because it's a very quick growing vegetable. So just do a little bit of research, but it's the decision is up to you. Any of them can be done as plants, any of them can be done as seed. A lot of time doing it as a plant, especially if you're a new gardener, is a better way to jump in.
And can we have one more question from Ms. Young?
Okay.
Can perennial plants survive in raised beds?
Yes, perennial plants can survive in raised beds. It just depends on, hold on for 1 second, Margaret. We're leaving that kale. We're leaving all of that. Sorry, I just saw that my entire kale garden was getting removed. Perennial plants can survive in raised gardens. It just depends on what those plants are. If it's ornamental plants, yes. If it's plants like this, these plants, the oregano, which is a perennial herb, the beets, even the beets, and I needed the little hand shovel when we get a chance. Even the beets can survive. The parsley can survive in raised beds. The sage, all of these vegetables can survive and thrive in raised beds, along with things like the pollinator plants that we were talking about. So the lavender, the coneflower, the black-eyed Susan. If it's a perennial plant, in this area, we really don't have, our winters have become milder and milder. So the raised beds are absolutely okay. They're absolutely okay. You might want to do a bigger top dressing. So you may want to put a bit more of leaves and things like that once the plants have died back, but they definitely can survive.
And artichoke as well too, right? Artichoke as well?
What's that?
Artichoke as well?
Artichoke as well, yes. Artichoke as well can go into raised beds, absolutely, yeah. Artichoke is a fun plant. It needs some room. for what you get from it, it has a spread on it, so you need a little bit of room. If there's another question, that's great. If not, I'm going to jump in about the beets.
We're all set. You can go ahead. Great.
Okay, I wanted to show our viewers. We planted the beets. So to ask about beets or seeds, things that you can plant by seeds, we put these beets in, and this has gotten a little bit, there's a little bit too much going on in this corner. So I'm going to take that and move it out of there. All right, so we planted the beets by seed in the beginning of the spring. And what I want to do is actually get in here, and I did it in the corner of the bed. And I want to get in here, and I want to divide this because I want a really nice beet plant when it comes to fall. So I've got this one that's actually starting to form a beet. That's going to be the beet. And then I've got these little guys that are not so much, okay? So these, I'm going to transplant these and make them, when they flush back out, I'm going to use the tops just for greens in a salad. But then I'm going to put this single, so there were about 6 plants there. I'm going to put this single beet plant back in there. With the beet, you want to make sure that you plant it at the level that it was growing. So it was growing, and there was a little bit of the beet showing right there. I want to make sure that I keep that showing. I'm going to push that down, fill that in, and then there we go. Now, all of these babies, I'm going to transplant, and I'm going to do that again with another clump and then another clump. I've got some big ones here, and these are probably, I'm going to disrupt just a little bit. These are probably showing even better signs of what they really are. Let's see here. And see, sometimes, and one of the reasons we want to divide it is sometimes they choke each other out and you don't get a really good formed beet plant. So I'm going to do the same thing here. Pop that in, push it into place. And then all of these, we will replant. You see, there's one that looks a little bit more like a beet. See? That's taking the form that we want to see. And we can put this one right here. When you put it in deeper than it was planted, you can just pull it up. When you get it at the level that you want it, you put it into place. And then I'll do that with all of these guys. So then we've got from seed, in the next couple of months, we will have really good beet. Now, let's say you don't need 60 beet plants. What do we do with this? We can clean up this. And if you notice, the staining of the beet is already present. These leaves can go into our smoothie, or you can clean this up and this can go into a salad. It's still young enough. Some of the yellow leaves, you don't really want to, if the leaf has started to turn yellow, maybe not. But there's still some good eating to be had here. And also some of the more juvenile plants we can put back into our row. So today we covered and talked a little bit about our herb garden. There's a lot of stuff going on in here. The herbs are doing really, really well. The thyme, the oregano, the parsley, all of that's ready for our first harvest. The other thing is if your parsley starts to go to seed like ours is doing, you can cut that off. There's a really simple recipe for parsley. It's parsley, button mushrooms. The button mushrooms are sliced up. You take the button mushrooms, you just wash them, slice them up, add parsley, add some olive oil, and squeeze 1 or 2 fresh lemons into that. Turn it, and you've got the best fresh summer salad. It's just 2 things: parsley, button mushrooms with some olive oil and fresh lemons. So even though the parsley is going to seed and may not be as decorative in another use, it definitely can become a summer salad. We also talked about thinning out our cool season vegetables. And then Katrina, how are we doing on time?
Hi, Derek. It's we have about 7 more minutes, and we also have about 3 other questions for the end.
Okay, while we're doing the questions, I'm going to go over here and start composting. So let me have the first question, and I'm going to head over here and start doing a makeshift attempt at composting. Margaret, do we have a bag or anything that we can put that in, or no?
I'll get one. I have one.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, Derek,
Go
here's
ahead.
the first question. Can you give some quick tips on crop rotations?
Okay, so with crop rotation, we talked about that when we spoke about what we were going to do with the kale, and we're going to come in and do the cucumbers behind it. Basically, what I did with the cucumbers, I took these from, they were tiny little plants. I've grown them out into and they were in a tiny little pot. I've grown them out into a larger pot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate. This is what we're talking about, rotating the crops. I'm going to add the proper nutrients to this bed. I'm going to put the cucumbers in this bed, but I've also left some of the kale in this bed to be reharvested. So that's going to rotate the crops. We've also got in this bed green beans. The green beans are going to be done. They're going to be harvested and done within the next 3 weeks, while the tomatoes that we put in are growing in. So that's rotating the crops, because that's making sure that even though we have a very limited amount of space, we put things in that come in and come to harvest after the other. And what you can usually do is stagger your cool season vegetables and then your warm season vegetables. So things like a cucumber can go in a little bit later because it produces a lot of cucumbers. By the end of the season, you're going to be giving cucumbers away. So put it in a little bit later, give the kale a little more time to grow, and then you can rotate that crop in.
Okay, we have another question. Mr. Burton said, if you don't mind, please tell us why you use raised beds and then box the beds in.
Okay, so the raised garden beds are, because we are at the museum, this is a temporary garden site. If you have a space where perhaps you're a renter and you negotiate with the person that you're renting from and you're able to put in a raised bed, it's a temporary garden bed. So we know that it's something that's not going to be permanent. And where we are at the museum, this is a temporary planting bed. It's a bed that also, and one of the beauties of a raised bed is you can control. Someone asked a question about organic gardening. You can control what is in the bed. So we know that 100% of the soil that is in this bed, it's all organic. It's all stuff that we brought in. We don't have to worry about any landfill stuff. We don't have to worry about any heavy metals, because everything that we brought in sphagnum moss, we brought in perlite, we brought in sand, we brought in pure filtered topsoil. Everything that we brought in, and we know that it is 100% pure. So it's when you have a limited space, when you have a temporary space, or when you want to make sure that you are controlling exactly what's in the garden. That's three of many reasons why we would do a raised bed. The reason that we've enclosed this bed is because here there are deer and there are other animals that will come in and eat your plants for you. So in order to coexist, we have our space and they can have the whole wilderness instead of our nice juicy plants, which is what they always tend to want to have. So we've enclosed the space and we've got the raised bed. So it's a controlled gardening environment.
And Dallas had another question. So did enslaved people grow their own herbal medicine or did they forage in the woods?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the first part of the question?
Did enslaved people grow their own herbal medicine or did they forage in the woods?
Okay, so I would believe, and this is just from what I've learned even today about Alethia, I would believe that they did both. I would believe that just through history, because enslaved people were not indigenous to this land. So somehow they learned that, for instance, elderberry. Elderberry is a native plant in Maryland. So in Upper Marlboro, where Alethia was born and ultimately freed, there would have been elderberry in the woods. And someone would have known about medicinal plants. Maybe it was one of the people that actually wanted to help enslaved people that said, you know, that berry, that blackberry, if you save that berry and you put that berry in a jar, if your children get sick over the winter, it's one of the purest forms of vitamin C. So I think that it was probably learned and harvested from the wild. And I would have to go out on a limb and say that they probably also cultivated it, because that would have ensured that when they needed elderberry or when they needed Echinacea, they had it. So I would say both things probably were in play.
I just want to chime in here too as well. You have questions of power and access and permission, right? So plantation owners, some were not comfortable with the enslaved practicing their quote unquote medicine, right? Medicine or their cultural beliefs, thinking about the power structure, this idea of mistrust, and others were completely fine with it as well. So I think it also it varied from place to place. Some
Exactly.
the enslaved were allowed to to plant and practice, and not only in terms of I would say caring for the other enslaved people in the plantation, but also for white members of the community as well too. So I would say it would vary from place to place. Some were probably allowed to plant their gardens and tend and have their herbal medicines, remedies, and others probably would, you most likely go under the radar, depending on what what species you had access to.
Exactly. And I think, you're absolutely right, Katrina. And I think what probably happened more so than not is that if they were denied access to medicinal plants, and they were living on a 200-acre plantation, I'm sure that there were pockets on the plantation, whether it's in the woods or on the periphery of the woods or at the adjacent plantation, that they could have gotten away with it, as you're saying, and made sure that they were able to self-sustain when it came to colds or whatever the remedy needed to be in the plant that they needed to grow. I'm sure that they were able to figure out a way to circumvent whatever oppression they may have been under.
And we have one last question from Monique. What do you add to the soil to add nutrients?
Oh, we talked about that right over here. So, and this year, there is a shortage, and we're going to go back over Dax. Dax is my camera person. Sorry to adjust something that's not on camera. This is what I call my black gold. Now, this year, there's a lot of wood. It almost looks like a mulch, but this is a leaf mold. This is a leaf compost is what they're calling it. And the reason they're calling it that is because we've had a rush on compost. So more people are gardening, compost is becoming scarcer. And so this is leaves and larger pieces of debris. Now, this is what we would do. And you can do this either as a top dressing once the plant is in place. And if Monique was with us when we were planting, we added some into the tomato. But as you go along in the season, you can do a top dressing like this. That's going to do two things. It's going to help to insulate the soil, but it's also going to add nutrients right at the base of the plant. So that's a really good way to do it. And the other thing that you can do is, and we'll end on this note, Katrina. So this is stuff that we're going to clean. This is kale that we're going to clean. We're going to cook. It's going to be delicious. This is some kale and stuff that got in. Lots of insects, lots of stuff is in it. What I'm going to do with this is I'm going to turn this into this. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to cut off all the root parts, because in a compost pile, if the compost is not hot enough, these roots will germinate. We're going to take this. You want to cut this down into little pieces. You can also do this with, if you're so inclined, there's compost tumblers and things like that. But you can bring all this together. You want to do this in either a compost tumbler, or you want to do it into a screened. You can look up how to compost it. I could do a 3-hour education series on composting. But all of the stuff that we're going to be throwing out today, we're not throwing out. We're going to be recycling it. We're going to be putting it back into the earth. And what's going to happen, Monique, is that you can do grass clippings. If you know, the grass clippings have not had chemicals added to it. You can do vegetable stuff. You can do stuff from your food table. Once again, if you know that it's been organic. This is that big piece of broccoli that we were going to harvest. You can do that. And if you do it something like that big, it's going to take longer to break down. So maybe cut it up a couple of times. But all of this can go back into the earth. And in about 3 to 6 months, depending on the composter that you're using, you can get a compost tumbler that's only 2 feet by, say, 2 feet, and it turns. There are composters that collapse upon themselves now. And within 2 to 3 months, if you're really good at it, 6 months on the outside, you're going to have this. Now, the other thing that you can do when you buy pre-made compost, you can give this a little bit of a boost by mixing that in. There's a little bit of a previous netting in there. Mixing that in and mixing that together. You can also do carbon, pure carbon, like newspaper. If you know the newspaper print is organic, and boxes, like the boxes that you get from Amazon or any of the companies that send you stuff, as long as they don't have lettering on it. If it's got lettering on it, you want to take that off because we don't know what that ink source was. But if it's just a pure carbon, cardboard boxes, rip it up, put it into the compost, and all of that is going to decay. But get yourself a good portable or compact composter first. And that's how you make your own black gold.
Thank you, Derek. So we've come to the end of our workshop. So to our attendees, thank you so much for your patience, your technical glitches and difficulties earlier. Thank you for staying with us. I know Ms. Kemp had a question about in-person workshops again. So quick note, announcement, we reopened to the public on August 6th, the museum. I'm still waiting to hear confirmation of when we can resume our in-person garden workshops. I would love to be able to have us harvest together in person, fingers crossed, but I will definitely update the group. But next Saturday, we have another virtual workshop where we'll have environmentalists and the community leader, Akima Price, will be in the garden in conversation with Derek, talking about gardens and the overall well-being and health of the community. Not only, obviously, the physical, but also the emotional and psychological health. And if you've not heard Akima speak, please, she is absolutely amazing. She's been embedded in this community work for 30 years. She's passionate, she's done really innovative work, and she's very thoughtful about this idea of green spaces, garden spaces as a place of community healing and emotional support. So if you can, please join us next Saturday at 10:30, virtually for now, but we're working on getting back in person to get you into our physical space. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Derek, Fabiola, thank you for leading a great conversation.
Thank you, Katrina.
We'll see you all next week, fingers crossed, and please take care and enjoy the rest of your Juneteenth. Hopefully you're going out to have some good food, good conversation, and good time spent with loved ones. So enjoy the rest of your weekend. We will see you next Saturday at 10:30. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.